welcome to Planet Poetry. I'm Peter Kenny.
And I'm Robin Houghton. And this is a special episode featuring poetry in translation. We're going to be celebrating the Sarah Maguire Prize for translation into English. Peter, first of all, had a chat with the chair of the judges, Alireza Abiz, and then with the prize-winning poet and translator.
Yeah, the prize is named after Sarah Maguire, who died in 2017. And she's fondly remembered as the founder of the Poetry Translation Centre and was a great champion of international poetry. What the competition does is shortlist 6 books translated into English, and that gives us a really excellent snapshot of world poetry as it is now.
I don't know about you, but this is unknown territory for me.
It was for me too, to be honest.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to it. So let's have a listen.
Alireza Abiz is an Iranian poet, literary critic, and award-winning translator. He has translated poetry by W.B. Yeats, Ted Hughes, Basil Bunting, Derek Walcott, Allen Ginsberg, and C.K. Williams into Persian. And he has written extensively on Persian contemporary literature and culture and published 5 collections of poetry. Alireza, welcome to Planet Poetry.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
That's certainly quite a list of translated poets. Do you have a favourite? Is that possible?
To be honest, I love all the poets that are translated, but my favorite translation, not the poet, my favorite book of translation among them is possibly my selection of poems by Derek Walcott. And the reason I say I love that book more than the others is because I wrote a very thorough introduction on his poetry. I included his Nobel Prize speech. And so it's not just a collection of translated poetry in Persian, but it also gives a kind of overview of Walcott's life, poetic culture, background, and everything. So I am very happy with that one.
I do like Walcott. The Fortunate Traveller, I think, was my favourite book of his. Omeros, I found quite a read.
Exactly, yeah.
So today we're chatting just a couple of days ahead of the announcement of the Sarah Maguire Prize for poets in translation in English for poets from Africa, Asia, Latin America, or the Middle East. And you were the chairman of the judges. What was it like judging a competition?
Yeah, it was a very great experience. I can say joyful, definitely, but at the same time agonizing because we had to exclude so many good books. We received submissions from, if I'm correct, 24 different countries and 18 different languages from all over the world, really, except the Western Europe and North America.
There's been an anthology just published that containing your shortlist of 6 translated books, and there's excerpts from each of them. And that collection really blew me away. I really loved it. The prize itself is named after Sarah M. Maguire, who founded the Poetry Translation Centre in 2004. I was reading on the website about one of her intentions was to ginger up English poetry, which I thought was a wonderful phrase. And, you know, I'm one of those sort of typical useless Englishmen that struggles with other languages. But actually, when it comes to reading poetry, most of the poets I love are actually not English, and I've only encountered through translation. So I've always been a real advocate of those people that are gifted enough, like yourself, to be able to sort of move from one language and, you know, help people like me, you know, reach out into other cultures. The first shortlisted collection was by Nouri Al-Jarrah, who is a Syrian. His book is called A Boat to Lesbos and Other Poems. Could you describe that collection?
Yes, absolutely. This was one of the really fantastic submissions that we got. And as you can guess from the title, it talks about the plight of the Syrian refugees, which fled Syria searching for a safe home elsewhere in the recent conflict. And as you can see, well, many of them took a boat to Greek islands, including Lesbos. And the idea of traveling on those seas around Crete is so ancient and goes back to mythology.
And Homer.
This is exactly, this is an epic poem without any heroism. But at the same time, we can see the beauty of the nature of these people, the rich culture which shines through every line of this book. And it is so contemporary.
And amazing poems in that collection. The second one, Factory Girls by Takao Ari. This book seemed to be all about a textile factory. I found it very magical and almost gothic and quite sexual.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the poet herself grew up around a textile factory. Her father owned one, but when due to the post-industrialization in Japan, they had to close down the factory. The workers were sent home. The interesting point about this collection is that the poems seem to be about the machinery, but they don't stop there. Then they go and describe the lives of people who have worked with them and the lasting influence left on those women, and they are all women. And so talking about how a country, an industrial country, when many of these industries die out, what happens to the people who work with those industries?
This phrase, post-industrial, when it's actually comes down to the detail of how people hold their hands and so on, it becomes very real and connected.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can even feel nostalgic toward those industrial, because at least there was a sense of community. People were not that isolated as they are in the post-industrial world. Yes, Fawzi Karim, the Iraqi poet who sadly passed away in 2019, he lived in London, and his collection, Incomprehensible Lesson, is a collection of poems about belonging and home. He was an exiled poet, an Iraqi exiled poet living in London, who went back to his hometown of Baghdad after the fall of Saddam Hussein, just to find out that this is not the home that he remembers. I found his exile is a more kind of existential exile, that there is no place to go back. There is no home left.
I felt like I was in the presence of a sort of major poet when I was reading them. So the next book we must talk about is Kim Yedaeum's book, Hysteria, translated from the Korean. The poems I read just leapt off the page. They were full of anger and blood and energy. And
to be honest, I didn't know much about Korean poetry. So this was one of the collections that opened a new world to me. It looked so fresh and full of life, rage and laughter and all is extreme passions. I can say it's an experimental exploration of self in different personas.
Moving on to our next poet, Judith Santopietro.
Tiawanaka.
Thank you. Poems for the Mother Coca, and that's translated from Spanish. I found that sort of gorgeous evocations of a journey into the world of Andean territories and reimagining ancient cultures.
To me, it was culturally significant because it talks about Latin American indigenous cultures. Because of the colonial past and also the globalization, many of these cultures are actually getting extinct. Languages are dying. Oral culture, storytelling is lost, if not recorded. The book actually continues that ancient tradition of oral storytelling and adds to that important heritage. And I think it's very important.
The final collection that you were considering was Lian. The book was called Anniversary Snow. I felt I've only had a short time to familiarize myself with these poems, but these poems seem just so rich and complex and international in their connections.
Exactly, yes. Well, Yang Lian is fortunately one of the poets who has been widely translated into English. His poetry is normally enigmatic, I can say, and this collection is no exception. At the same time that he's talking about his native China, historical roots of Chinese culture, and about his own experiences as an exiled poet. So themes of exile, themes of migration, themes of liminal spaces, At the same time, there is this sense of internationalism in his poetry and talking about major ancient philosophical themes of human existence. The translation, of course, the same as other collections, the translations were perfect.
Obviously, you read lots and lots of poetry for this prize, and the shortlist of 6 is really extraordinary. Are there any common threads emerging?
Yeah, well, one thing that I can say is that poetry has always been considered as a kind of mirror to the culture. And the submissions to this prize, to me, it somehow proved this. We cannot identify a single trend for all of these cultures. But one thing that I can say is that it seemed that personal narratives are somehow becoming the fashion. I don't know if that's the right term to say. But the fact that if you want to talk about even big themes, even if you want to talk about major universal themes, it serves better if you make it personal.
Yeah.
This sense of narrative, which is becoming more important.
Alireza, thank you very much for giving us your time, and it's been an absolute delight talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Wow, that really sounded like there are some interesting shortlisted collections there. Are you going to keep us in suspense, or are you going to tell us who won?
Well, I think we demand a drum roll and a dog bark. And the winner was Lian, translated by Brian Holton.
Oh, hey! And that was awarded, that was the end of March, wasn't it? That was
on the 25th of March. That
25th
was
of March.
Announced, yes.
Wow. Well, in that case, let's hear your interview with the two of them. I believe you're going to talk to Lian first and then Brian.
Yes, that's right. And to be honest, when I heard that Lian won, my heart sank a little bit, because of all the poets, I found his work most challenging and most difficult in the small amount that I'd read. But actually, in reading a bit more, I think, wow, it was richly deserved, and I'm so pleased that he won in the end.
Excellent. You accepted the challenge and enjoyed it, so
it was a stern challenge.
Let's hear the interview.
I would like to welcome Lian to Planet Poetry. So first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on winning that 2020 Sarah Maguire Prize for Poetry and Translation for your book Anniversary Snow. It was translated by your long-standing collaborator Brian Holton, along with poems produced in collaboration with English and US poets such as W.N. Herbert, L. Lee, Pascal Petit, Fiona Sampson, George Surtees and Joshua Weiner. Translators, often get a bit ignored, don't they? But Brian Holton has worked as your English translator since the 90s, I think. How important is that relationship to you?
Well, the relationship between me and Brian Holton, I think, is very unique, because so far as I hear, there were never any Chinese poets work together with their translators for actually 28 years. And the first book was published in 1995. So we know each other really well. The contemporary Chinese poetry is a very challenging thing, because we are in the middle or meeting point between the very classical tradition of the classical Chinese poetry and the very contemporary living experience. Chinese, for a long time, it was a rather like a locked-in place. But especially after the end of Cultural Revolution, since 80s, and then especially after the 1990s, and China was very much opened up to the world. So the contemporary Chinese poets, or even every poem, has to face this joint contacts, making the works meaningful. At this point, Brian Holton and I are almost experienced both depth and difficulties. His translation faced to all these challenges and the questions and the same as me, and try to answer those questions. Many different books, and so far we actually have published 13 books already.
It's like your brothers in poetry.
It's a bit like that, but the translators and the poets are great friends, but at the same time, almost like a twin brother. They are blood so close, but they are also always challenging each other. Sometimes very intense, sometimes quite difficult. When I contacted him in 1993, I didn't speak any word of English. Now he sent all his draft of translation to me, and I will read every line and I will put my comments on them, the red colored of the words. So after all, you could see this whole page is like full of blood. And yeah, so it's a wounded translation. I will leave this wounded body to him to make his final version. And I think that is a very healthy way to cooperate.
I was lucky enough to talk to Alireza Abiz. His description of Anniversary Snow, he said it's a multi-layered, lyrically complex collection that reflects Yang's myriad preconceptions as an artist, including exile, flows of migration, artistic friendships, the power of art, history, music, and language, and as well as the endless source of inspiration drawn from Chinese culture. In a way, that sounds like you write about absolutely everything. That's how Mr. Abiz described it. How would you describe it? Because there will be quite a few people listening to this that have never seen your work, and you have to be a salesman now as well. As a 21st century poet.
I'm very happy to be the salesman of poetry, because normally nobody buys poetry. So in this case, the salesman of poetry is the most challenging job, I think. It's very difficult because my poems, in the deepest layer on the concept of poetry, I have to put my root into the very depth of the Chinese culture, not the Chinese, like classical Chinese books, but to open up the books and then to put the root into the real living experience as the foundation of those books. No matter was it Lao Tzu or Confucius or even Book of Changes. And all those great classical books, it's actually based on very real living experience. So I have to put my contemporary root all the way into the soil, maybe back to thousands and thousands of years, then to bring this kind of ancient and classical experience into our contemporary life and make them fully alive, and making myself join them and they join me and join together as a living experience. When the Tiananmen massacre happened in Beijing in 1989, and then there was so many people feeling like surprising and crying because of this killing and death. And I had this question. I said, if we were so surprised about this kind of a massacre, like we never remember any death happened before, and then how could we guarantee all this crying or surprising is not washing our memory away again to put the root back to the deep history? That means to bring the every happening now from an event into a situation. I think that is something very, very important for me. But because of this depth rooted in the cultural background, and it has to be also faced to the challenge of the creative way of writing today. To me, these two sides, the contents and the way of writing, actually they are also deeply united. And I can only create or even invent a new way of writing in order to describe the certain depth, which I think never exist in the Chinese writing before. Maybe never exist in the international writing too. So this way of writing has to face to this demanding of the unique contents. So Leo mentioned the language, the political power, the philosophical thinking, and this kind of a multi layers. I think that's must be there. All those layers must be in my writing, but also in the contemporary Chinese writing. Without all these necessary layers, then the contemporary Chinese poetry cannot really stay as yourself.
In coming to your work as a new reader, I think one of the things that struck me was your work contains a very fluid relationship with time. Your poem Dance, Swimming Naked with Li Bei, and in that you're referring back to the famous poet from the Tang dynasty who was supposed to have drunkenly tried to grab the moon reflected in the water and drown. But the poem itself has got a lovely slurring of time and illusion, and you are by nature really somebody who goes across borders, physically in your life, but also, in your thinking. I found it quite challenging to begin with because it is so multi-leveled.
Time is a very central point of my poems, but actually all the way back to the very central point of the Chinese language. I think that's the most maybe interesting or maybe most profound difference. The Chinese verbs has no tense. So the Chinese verbs forever stay in the original form. So we only add the time difference. When I drink, I say, I drink now. I drink yesterday. I drink tomorrow. Drink is never changed. If you remember this linguistic nature, the timeless situation, even Tiananmen Massacre, when I wrote the poem simply titled 1989, and the end up the poem, this is no doubt a perfectly ordinary year. And I surprised every friends, and they said, how could you thinking this year was an ordinary year? But I said, when you look the history and when you see how the nightmare repeat, and then you will see the meaning of ordinary year. And actually, even since 1989, I just had to count how many more nightmares happened since then, in China, but internationally, all the way until all this crazy world today. So that's why after the Cultural Revolution, when we start our writing, at the beginning, when we woke up from the nightmare of Cultural Revolution, and as a very young poet, I was focused at the theme of the pain of time, because we are a so-called ancient culture, but in the Cultural Revolution, since the whole nation, nearly billions of people, now is billions of people, it seems totally lost the humanity and lost the common sense. And this was really crazy. So how does the ancient culture finally end up like this? And I call that pain of time.
Pain of time.
But then when after Tiananmen Massacre and also after our experience of exile and so on, and then I developed my understanding, not the pain of time, but even pain of non-time or timeless, because the situation is always brought us back to this darkness, to this hopeless, to this impossibility. And so this seems the time was simply cancelled by our life. And so this was, again, addressing another layer inside of like my writing, but also my rather philosophical understanding. And if you look my poems about Li Bo, Li Bai, or other classical Chinese poets, but at the same time, I also wrote poems about Ovid, about Dante, about W.B. Yeats, also Ezra Pound. But then you will see, even with just to mention those names, if they are all kind of fragments of our human situations, and they can simply clash together. And then with its difference between the times and different cultures, and then you can see the hidden layer inside of there. It's kind of a timeless situation. So the Chinese language could be an inspiration of very contemporary writing. I was actually tried to do something like that.
You write sequences a lot. There was one sequence you wrote about the I Ching, the Book of Changes, which is something I've had a copy, the Richard Wilhelm translation, since I was in my teens, and I've always turned to it. It seems so, for a European, so exotic, and yet I feel like I've learned things from it by reading it, and also, using the coins to get divinations and so on. The I Ching is one massive sequence of changes and progressions and describing the whole of nature in a way. It seems like an amazing subject to tackle.
It's, again, really got point, because I have one essay written very long time ago. I think it's about 1984. It was titled The Space of Intelligence. And it's actually, later I have another article simply titled The Poetic of Space, which means, like I just mentioned before, the space of language or space of the form of poetry is hold this multi layers of the understandings about time, because that's based on the space was built up with the language and also with the forms of poetry. And finally, each sequence is almost like a multi-layers small universe. And the time is a float within the universe. And so the universe is not only deadly like sculpture, like stone sculpture. It's actually alive, but the time circling inside of the universe, almost like our blood circling inside of our body. So this keeping the body is alive, but the blood did not flow outside of the body, luckily. And yeah, so I Ching, I did, I wrote a long poem, actually not only as a sequence, it's like a book-long poem. It's simply titled E-Y-I, and this E had been translated into English, but published in the United States, in the Los Angeles publisher. This book was written between 1984, finished in 1989 when I arrived New Zealand. So it took me 5 years to write this book-long poem based on I Ching, but in very much my way of understanding of I Ching, but different from the normal, let's say the academic way to talk about I Ching. So because when I read I Ching, I did not using that as a fixed philosophical theory or book or something. I treat I Ching almost like a living system of natural symbols. You can see the 8 big images, like heaven, the earth, the fire, the thunder, the water, the marsh, and this totally 8 things. And but how they actually joined each other and influenced each other. And after all, the external world and the internal world also deeply linked and influence each other. But then this limitless world happened within a limited space. And that is the concept of poetry I want to actually build up in my writing. So my sequence, if you look all the way from E, which the last big book I wrote in China, and then Where the Sea Stands Still is a smaller sequence, but the first time I using this kind of a structure outside of China. And then following with the concentric circles, again, another book-long poem. And then after that one, after some smaller collections, and then the very big narrative poems, another book-long poem. And so this kind of a rather big works is share the same idea, which is the multi-layers, and then the structure hold this endlessly moving contents inside of works. After all, even I call the E and then concentric circles and then narrative poem together as a concentric circles trinity. And this 3 book-long poems, the pure writing time, it was more than 14 years. And from the beginning of the writing of E and the end of writing of narrative poems, crossing more than 25 years of my life. And so that another layer of based on each sequence. So you could say that this kind of a multi-layers of concentric circles developed. Yeah. After all, I hope that the people will agree with me. All this development of writings could be seen as one long poem.
I was talking to Pascal Petit fairly recently, but she's one of the poets that have translated your work. They're non-Chinese speakers, so you give them like a translation and then they rework it, do they? Or how does that work?
So in this case, like Pascal and me, I think when we live in London, it's interesting enough. In the North London, there's one place called Lee Valley. And I live in the west side of Lee Valley, Stoke Newington, and she lives in the east side of Lee Valley. That's small area. I don't remember the time. So quite often I crossing the Lee Valley to go to her home, and we sit together and doing the translation. At the beginning, of course, I'm more conceptually just trying to push this project, but with actually a lot of question marks inside of myself, and whether we can really do that, and how good we could do or something, because I know the very weaker points of us, because I don't speak good English and they do not speak single word of Chinese, and so it's really funny. But when we actually sit together, Pascal, Fiona, W.N. Herbert, all those poets, I certainly find something extremely interesting, because maybe we are weaker on the language, but we were so much better on the understanding of poetry, especially the way of thinking of poetry. And if we keep these words, this sentence in our mind, and suddenly you will realize, and the way of thinking of poetry, no matter the time and the space and the language, everywhere is the same. So how to bring the life experience becoming the spiritual energy, and how to bring this energy both in the thinking and also in the way of writing, and then create poetry. It's the same. So that's why our understanding like a lightning, and to lead our project, every line, every image, every poem. That's why after all, if you have a chance to see another book called the Third Shore, it's published also by Scherzman, and that book is especially collected the works of the Chinese and English poets in the mutual translation. This title came from a wonderful expression of Walter Benjamin, and he talked about that translation is the third language, and therefore I turned that into the third language into the third shore. In the small piece I wrote to the Sarah Maguire Prize, I even mentioned maybe in all this global context, we have only the third shore. And so it's,
yes.
Yeah. So I think the poetry and the poet's translation could building up a certain model of how to do the exchange on the third floor.
That's a lovely thought. Would it be possible to ask you to read a poem to finish off?
There's a poem I like quite a lot because it was almost the latest poem in this collection. Maybe you know the Thomas Tranströmer, and he is the Swedish poet. And
yes, I like him.
Yeah, we actually met for the first time in Beijing when he came to Beijing in 1980s. That time I didn't speak any word of English, but because he has one quite big sequence, it's called the Baltics, the only big poem he actually wrote. And then when he was in Beijing, he heard that I wrote some rather longer poem. And he was so excited and held me and told me this. Yeah, he wrote that poem. And this title, Baltics, not only Baltic, but with a plural S, it was very, very interesting. And then 2 years ago, when my another book published in Sweden, my wife and I went to Sweden, and there was a big reading. And then we were together with the Thomas's wife to visit Thomas' grave in Stockholm. And then I stood there and thought about our meeting and our journey of life all the way since 1980s until now. Then it's actually becoming this poem. 在特朗斯特罗莫墓前，北方结冰的海也坐在这张石凳上，默默的对视，留下冷的琥珀。一条风雪路也追着船头压进冰层的碎裂声。我听见弹奏的左手更慢了，一笔一画的签名像条海岸横在大气里，蜡烛和白玫瑰仿佛刚刚游出漆黑的海水。我听见碑文在问：托马斯，诗的洁癖能带我们到哪里去？你皱着眉头盯住我的样子，就像我眼里堆满了水平线。总有一个人被留下，穿过你复数的海，继续夜航。托马斯，3月的泥土软了，墓碑像无风带的帆。伦马尔岛上的沉默正带我们到哪里去？莫妮卡读懂了，退潮深处一双亮晶晶的回眸。一张石凳前， 石头小栈桥打着旗语，舒伯特的忧伤过滤掉整整1世纪的杂质，真入雾的忧伤，河口的忧伤，白皑皑伸向对岸。水移动，我们知道冰下泥也在移动。一个新的故事紧挤着压舱石。
It's funny how you can always tell the end of a poem, whatever language it is in.
Okay,
that sounded great. It's been absolutely a great honour to talk to you. And now we hear Brian Holton read his translation of Yang Lian's poem.
At Tranströmer's grave. The freezing northern sea is also sitting on this stone bench, a silent eye to eye, leaving the amber of cold behind. A snowstorm road is also chasing the crackle of a prow pushing into a layer of ice. I hear the left hand playing slower, a stroke-by-stroke written signature like another seashore, sideways in the air. Candles and white roses seem just to have swum out of jet-black seawater. I hear the inscription asking Thomas, where could the fastidiousness of poetry take us? The way you knit your brow and closely watch me as if my eye was filled with marine horizons. There's always one left behind, keeping up night flights through your plural seas. Thomas, the March mud is softening, the gravestone like a sail in a windless sea. Where is the silence of Runmaru Island taking us? Monica read and understood a pair of sparkling glances deep in the ebb tide in front of the stone bench. A little stone pier waves its semaphore. Schubert's sorrows filter out the impurities of a whole century, pouring into sorrows of mist, sorrows of the estuary, snow white stretching to the other shore. Water moves. We know that under the ice you are also moving. A new story squeezed into the ballast of stone.
Wow, that's absolutely gorgeous. Beautifully read as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've done it before.
Yes, I can tell. You've had a long-standing relationship with Yang Lian since the 90s, I believe. But not only are you very well known for translating loads of his books, you also do other translations in Chinese, and you're a poet and singer-songwriter and performer as well. So, you do have another life beyond your relationship.
I do. And I mean, what I do basically is I translate Yang Lian into English, but I translate classical poetry into Scots, which is my mother tongue, and that's a tremendous refreshment moving from Yang Lian, so I can swap between the two. If I get bored with one, I go to the other. I mean, when I first started, I saw his stuff in 1988-9 when I was living in China, where he and the other guys of his group, Dodo, Bei Dao, and so on, they were like rock stars.
These are the Misty Poets, aren't they?
Yes, the Misty Poets, yes. They weren't allowed, but they could have filled stadiums.
Wow.
To this day, whenever I read with Yang, there are sort of ladies of a certain age who go, when I was a student.
Yeah. And
then when I started translating him, I really didn't know what he meant. Because to be honest, I never really translated modern poetry before. I was a classicist. I was a 17th century man, really. And so it was quite an adventure. And in the beginning, he was in Sydney, and then I was in Durham. And he didn't have a computer. He had almost no English. So if I had a query, it had to be written out in my best Chinese, in longhand, posted airmail to Sydney, And with luck, in 3 weeks, I might get an answer back. So
yes, he was saying how you did this translation by correspondence from the opposite sides of the world.
I know. I mean, looking back, it was a hoot. But gradually I began to see how it works. And a lot of his poetry, I mean, I've written about this in one of the afterwards of one of the books, but it wasn't until we were in New Zealand. We'd been at a big conference called Poetry in Exile, which was mostly poets and very few parasitic academics. So it was, give it a different tone, you know. It was a great week in Auckland. And at the end of it, we went to somebody's bach, you know, a house by the sea. And as Yang came running back in, dragged me out the balcony and said, look. And there, on the horizon line, there was a perfect V-shaped break between the hills. And beyond that, the sea, the turquoise sea. And he said, look. The first line of one of his big poem sequences where the sea stands still, 蓝的总是更高, blue is always higher. And I'd taken it as abstract, but it isn't. Looking through this gap, the sea does seem to rise towards the horizon. So, I mean, that's when I began to see that it's like tessera. You know, it's like a tessellation of tiny little images put together to make a mosaic of a larger picture. You know, so it doesn't respond well to sort of thinking as you read, but if you let it wash over you and the images pile up as in a dream, it'll take you somewhere you've never been before.
That's a beautiful thing. I think we'll have to end there, I'm afraid, Brian.
That's a pity. I could tell you an awful lot more lies.
Yeah.
So Peter, you read an anthology, did you, that included some of Lian's poems and some of all the other shortlisted poets?
Yeah, it's an anthology. Actually, it's well worth getting hold of.
Oh, yeah,
it's called the Sarah Maguire Prize 2020, it's called. Yeah, some amazing poems in there. Really, the Korean poetry that was really shocking and kind of like a Me Too thing. And I love the Japanese poet in it, particularly.
So the winner, Yang Lian is clearly a bit of a rock star, isn't he? He's has a global reputation, my understanding.
I think so, yeah. I mean, he's, when I was talking to him and afterwards thinking about him, he's like the equivalent of Ezra Pound, I think. I think he's of that importance, you know, in Chinese poetry. I
certainly found him, I mean, he talks so clearly. It's so interesting. He talked about the layers of cultural history and the importance of being rooted in that. He gave that anecdote, didn't he, about people who witnessed Tiananmen Square massacre. Some people seemed surprised that such a thing could happen. And he said, well, actually, it's just another layer in the history of China. And it's all understandable if you dig deep enough.
I think I sort of accidentally stumbled across the key to understanding him by pure fluke, really, which is around time. You know, what he was saying about verbs in Mandarin not having any tense.
Oh yes, that's fascinating, isn't it? The fact you have to use a modifier to specify the time. That must be really interesting. And of course, Mandarin, it is a tone language, isn't it? So I loved hearing him read the poem in his own language, and then to hear it read by Brian. Of course, I was also fascinated by what he had to say about the translation process. That's the fact that Brian will send him a first draft and then he puts his red pen right through it until it's a bleeding manuscript. I can just imagine that sort of collaboration that they've had for decades. It must be a fantastic process.
Spoken to both of them about how they feel about the other. There seems to be a very Mickey-taking relationship between them. I think they're extremely good friends, but they're not above ridiculing each other. I think that's one of the secrets to their longevity. But there's deep respect there as well, which is a lovely relationship to, you know, witness even from the outside. Brian, I love the way he translates things into Scots as well. I think he's the only living...
That is fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, that is.
So I hope our listeners have enjoyed going round the world in their armchairs. I certainly feel like, quite challenged by all the different poetries I've encountered.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It's been well worth it.
We'll have to do a similar thing again, I think. Another special later in the year.
It makes you sort of want to sit around reading Philip Larkin for a bit, though, and kind of...
Philip Larkin. What sort of a palate cleanse? I can think of better palate cleanses than Philip Larkin.
Just something kind of middle-brow and English and not really...
Yeah. Oh, yes, lovely. Well, when I've finished my Dante studies, I'm going to be reading... I've decided I'm going to read Tennyson's In Memoriam.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I've never read it. And it's one of those things that came up on my course last term, and I just didn't have time, together with tens of thousands of other texts I didn't have time to look at. So that's my next little project. Are you looking forward to going around the world sometime, Peter, anytime soon? Or or will the local pub suffice?
The local pub would, I think the glory of this year is going to be just reclaiming comedy basics, like being able to visit your local without, sort of plague mask on or stuff like that. That still seems quite a long way away.
It does, doesn't it? I thought I was going to be able to go swimming as of next week, but then I read something today to suggest that indoor swimming won't be allowed till May now. So I'm a little bit low about that because I've been desperate for some exercise. Anyway.
Yeah, chiefly is the hairdresser for me, because I just look like Sideshow Bob out of The Simpsons at the moment. And
well, you are looking a bit boof, but I couldn't possibly criticise because I'm looking like Lady Godiva at the moment, except I am clothed. I must say, just tell our listeners that.
They don't. The thing about this podcast is we can actually see each other while we're recording.
Oh, we can. We can. But thankfully, we're not...
Mercifully, you're spared the sight of these haircuts.
I'm very pleased to have a face for radio, as they say.
Yes, me too.